In this lesson, we are moving on from looking at the role and structure of Parliament within the UK's political system, and we're now going to start to talk about the Prime Minister and the executive branch. This lesson is going to serve as a basic introduction to the executive branch, and then in future lessons time, we're going to start to unpack some of the key components of the executive branch, talk about the roles and functions of various elements of it, talk about the powers of the Prime Minister, the theories of prime ministerial power, as well as looking at the cabinet as well as the government ministers more generally. So this is an introduction to the executive branch of the UK's government. This usually involves an examination of the Prime Minister, the core ministers of state, which is generally described as the cabinet system, and the broader ministers of state that exist as well, and some of the principles that apply to these ministers, and the broader civil service and policy direction as well. So essentially, the executive branch of government is concerned with the formulation and the implementation of policy, whereas the legislative branch of government is concerned with the passing of law, and the judicial branch is concerned with the interpretation and the application of law. The executive branch is concerned with the formulation and implementation of policy. In the UK system of parliamentary governance, we see that ministers, i.e. members that form the core body of the executive, are drawn from Parliament and are therefore accountable to Parliament. Now, the Prime Minister and the cabinet are the main institutions within the executive, but this is not to suggest that they are the entire institutions within the executive, because the whole of the civil service represents the entirety of the executive as well. Now, the Prime Minister is the head of government. He or she will provide political leadership within the cabinet system and within the United Kingdom as a whole. Currently, our Prime Minister at time of recording is Rishi Sunak. Now, of course, I've put a little date marker down here as to note to anybody in the future when this lesson was recorded, because as we have seen in the last few years or so, there have been quite a few different prime ministers depending on when you are watching this lesson. So the prime minister that exists now, who's Rishi Sunak, may not be the prime minister in 1 month, 2 months, 5 months, who knows. Essentially, the prime minister will provide the political leadership within the cabinet system. They will chair the cabinet. They will appoint ministers to the cabinet, and they are the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons by way of convention. This is a convention, a constitutional convention. It's not ratified law. It is just a common state of practice that is followed by everybody within the government structure. It is commonly recognised that the first Prime Minister was the MP by the name of Robert Walpole. Now, Walpole was in office from 1721 to 1742, and he is recognised as the first Prime Minister because he commanded a majority of support in the House of Commons. And so the idea of Prime Minister, the role of Prime Minister, is sort of one that came out of and was born out of historical tradition, more so than being clearly ratified by some kind of constitution or ratified by some kind of law. We know as well that the official residence of the Prime Minister, and arguably the core centrepiece of this executive branch in its entirety, is of course 10 Downing Street. With that in mind then, what are the requirements if you want to be Prime Minister? Let's say you wake up one morning and you decide that you want to be the Prime Minister of Great Britain and United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Well, what are the requirements? There are 3 main requirements that you need to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The first is that he or she must be a member of the Westminster Parliament. Now, until the 19th century, the Prime Minister usually came out of the House of Lords, and this is obviously because the House of Lords was considered to be the upper house, the more powerful house, and the house that the House of Commons is subordinate to up until the 19th century. Now, as the Commons gains power over the years, over the 19th and 20th century, it becomes constitutional convention that the Prime Minister should be an MP, a Member of Parliament. This is not to suggest that it is flatly disallowed for a prime minister to be a member of the House of Lords. However, it is convention that they are members of Parliament. They are members of the House of Commons. If there was a prime minister to come out of the House of Lords, I'm not particularly sure what would happen in terms of the constitutional crisis that may be caused by that set of events, but for the most part it will never happen in all likelihood, owing to the democratic nature of the state and the importance of the power of the people in choosing and electing members of Parliament and choosing and electing a prime minister. He or she must be the leader of a political party, and the Prime Minister must have the support of his or her party. So there are many ample examples where the Prime Minister has not got the support of his or her party. Famously, we remember Margaret Thatcher very nearly did not have the support of her party and the Conservatives when she fell from power. She won the no confidence vote by a very slim majority, and ultimately would resign as a result of the fact that it had been made clear that she had lost the confidence of her party. Similar things happened with Boris Johnson. Similar things happened with Liz Truss as well. These are things that tend to take place on a regular basis, and at least in the modern conception of our political system, especially following both COVID and the coronavirus pandemic, it is seemed to be very clearly the case that the Prime Minister has had their confidence, the confidence of the Prime Minister by the party, waned over a period of time. The third requirement for Prime Minister is that the political party that he or she has the support of will normally have a majority in the House of Commons. This is done so often after the winning of a general election, and this is the most common route that a Prime Minister can become a Prime Minister, essentially. A person can become a Prime Minister. This is always subject to election results. Now, while this is the case on paper, in recent years, we have seen prime ministers become elected by the internal membership of the Conservative Party rather than by general election. In fact, we have only had 2 general elections since 2017. However, we have had, I believe, 4 prime ministers in that time. We had Theresa May, then we had Boris Johnson, we had an election, then we had Liz Truss, and now we have Rishi Sunak. So, given the fact that it is usually the case that a prime minister will be born out of the general election results, this has actually not been the case in recent memory. Now, in terms of commanding a majority, this is not a formal requirement for Prime Minister, because you can actually form a government out of a minority within the House of Commons. The most common type of government that we have and that we see throughout UK's political history is the idea of the majority government. This is where one political party has an absolute majority of the seats in the House of Commons and therefore forms a government as a result. Government ministers are often members of this single party. It is general convention that you will pick government ministers that are aligned politically to you, rather than picking people from the opposite bench and people who are in opposition to your political ideology. This makes perfect sense, given the fact that you win an election on the basis of a manifesto which gives you a mandate to implement those manifesto pledges, and so as a result of which you will pick either a Conservative if you are the Conservative government, or Labour if you're a Labour government. In very rare circumstances, we might have situations where there is a minority government. This is where no political party has an absolute majority of the seats in the House of Commons. This often does not stand in and of itself. So it is often not something that takes place whereby a minority is formed and then a political party, while controlling a minority in the House of Commons, decides to essentially implement and form a government that is in the minority. The reason for this is because you have to rely on, at a constant pace and consistently in every single piece of legislation, you have to rely on support from across the aisle in the House of Commons, because you don't have a majority. You can't pass law if you don't have a majority, and so in doing so you have to rely on the opposite side of the political aisle, which means you either have to hope that the people on the other side of the political aisle are willing, at least in however many numbers you need, to vote for your whatever policy you want implementing, or you have to make concessions on the basis of policy, and therefore it becomes quite a messy and not a particularly productive system. And that's why most of the time, the if there is no majority in Parliament, we get what is known as a hung parliament. It leads to a coalition instead. So a coalition government is where there is no political party that has an absolute majority of seats in parliament. And in reaction to this, we see that two or more parties will agree to form a government together and to work together as a single government of two or more parties. This is often something that takes place at a quite consistent rate when we talk about systems of elections where we have proportional representation. In the United Kingdom, and when we talk about general elections, we use the first past the post, which of course is not proportional, and so as a result of which it is less likely to spit out a hung parliament, essentially, despite the fact that we've had two in the last 10 or so years, with the 2010 general election leading to the Conservative Lib Dem coalition government, and then you also have in 2017 Theresa May's government ending up in a hung parliament situation as well.